Hi folks, this is Dr. Brent Satterley, and I'm going to be talking to you today about organizing constructs of gender and gender identities of various kinds. Let's get started. First, I want to talk about why you're here. As with the sexual orientation modules, many trans and queer and gender fluid and non-binary gender individuals often experience various forms of discrimination, as you can see, and insufficient services from social workers, from mental health professionals, from counselors, etc., etc. And what we know is that providers are in fact often being called to attend to LGBTQ folks and some of their various issues in lots of different mediums. We do know that LGBTQ individuals seek counseling services at much higher rates than non-LGBTQ folks, and unfortunately there is a lack of clinical training in this respect for LGBTQ, specifically around transgender, gender fluid, agender persons, etc., and that needs to be remedied. It's one of the reasons for this course. We'll talk specifically about some of the other identities that I just mentioned. But this is why you're really here. As you can see, trans folks are a broad representatives of different populations, anything from families, from individuals, from youth, from older adults, people of color, people with disabilities, etc., etc. At the end of the day, a lot of what this is about is just being competent to be able to work well with people of varying gender identities and expressions. And again, we reflect on the alphabet soup of queerness. It's really important to be able to tease out the experience of folks' sexual orientation versus people's gender and gender identity. And oftentimes people think those things are the same. They are not. As you can see here, again, we identify lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, which is a very much broad and umbrella term that can sometimes be reflective not of sexuality and or gender, but also transgender, intersex, and asexual. Asexual is a sexual orientation we talked about previously, but transgender, identify, and intersex are two different components, two different experiences of gender identity and or gender expression, and we'll talk more clearly about that. Regardless, you can see that there's lots of different terminology. This is just scratching the surface. So, what is gender? Let's start there. Let's take a step back. Let's do some gender clarifications. Gender isn't really like this. That is the binary. That is the, male or female. Oftentimes representations that you'll see on restrooms. And in fact, gender is more like this. A wide variety of different ways that people identify and express themselves in various ways in their life. And we're going to present to you a model by Green and Mauro, who created the Teaching Transgender Toolkit, which I highly recommend for you to take a look at. And it incorporates biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, and distinguishes those quite clearly. The SEIO, or biological sex, expression, identity, and orientation model, really takes these four components and distinguishes them quite clearly. Biological sex, a person's combination of chromosomes, gonads, or hormones. That is their biological package in ways that really contribute to how people often will end up saying their biological sex is really their gender. It's not. As you can see here, gender identity is a person's internal and psychological sense of who they are as a gendered being, how people feel on the inside, how they experience themselves, and so on and so forth. Whereas gender expression is how a person communicates gender identity to others. That could be through the way they talk, the way they express themselves, their mannerisms, their characteristics, their clothing, their attire, how they identify themselves, etc., etc. And finally, sexual orientation has to do, of course, as we talked about in the previous modules, reflecting those to whom a person is emotionally, physically, sexually, and or psychologically attracted. In other words, the people that you fall in love with, the people that you're attracted to. That's the SEIO model. It really distinguishes various components that people often get confused about. So what about transgender? It is in fact an umbrella term, and it is an identity that reflects a non-traditional gender identity, status, or experience. And as you can see here from this image, it incorporates a wide variety of folks. And this is not this is not comprehensive. This is just representative. Some individuals who are cross-dressers, cross-dressing people, that is often people who dress in clothing of another gender, often for the purpose of expression or stress management, or even in some cases erotic satisfaction. And the experience of trans non-binary people and transgender men and transgender women. We'll talk about those identities in just a minute. The piece I wanted to really include here was the distinction between transgender people and folks who are intersex. People who are intersex are individuals who are typically born with blended or ambiguous genitalia. And they would not fall under the transgender umbrella in this respect. And so it's important to distinguish between those two experiences. Well, what about gender queer, gender fluid? Hang on, we'll get there. All right, so terminology. This is one area where people often get confused, confounded, not really understanding. Again, we can go to Green and Mauer's text and look at the term transgender as an adjective used to describe a person whose gender identity is incongruent with the biological sex they were assigned at birth. It's important to be able to distinguish. This is really where we see the difference between biological sex and gender identity. Those two things aren't necessarily the same. Often, for many people, they are, and that's what we call cisgender, an adjective used to describe a person whose gender identity is congruent with the biological sex they were assigned at birth. Now, other terminologies. As I mentioned some terms earlier, there are more beyond this. The term non-binary gender has to do with the spectrum of gender identities and expression based in the rejection of a binary assumption that gender is an either-or option based on sex assigned at birth. That is, there are a wide variety of ways that people can express themselves, can identify with regard to gender and gender identity, and it doesn't necessarily have to be based on the gender binary. There's only two choices, male or female, that's it. And so the notion of non-binary gender is an important category, as you can see from some of the earlier slides. Gender fluid is a person whose gender identity or expression shifts between masculine and feminine or moves across the spectrum between both. And it's important to recognize that sometimes people want to express themselves in a way that's more masculine, and that can be through dress, mannerisms, expression, etc., or more feminine, maybe how they're feeling in that context as well. Or sometimes but somewhere in between. Gender queer is a person whose gender identity is neither male nor female, is between or even beyond genders, or is some combination of genders in that experience. So oftentimes, if you're thinking a little bit about gender as a binary thing, where you've got male in a bubble on one side and female in a bubble on another, gender queer could be somewhere in between those, or maybe somewhere else, not necessarily in between or anywhere near any association between those male and female bubbles. It's really outside of the gender binary, gender queer. And agender, a person who does not identify as having a gender identity that can be categorized as male or female, and sometimes indicates identifying as not having a gender identity at all. Right. The terminology is understandably confusing for many people. It's important to familiarize yourself. This is not the only terms, however. As you can see, they abound. Bigender, identifying as two genders. Gender fluid, as we mentioned, gender and gender identity and expression might change. Trigender, identifying as three genders. Gender neutrosis, neutrois, gender neutral. Agender, no gender or genderless in that experience. Androgen, having both masculine and feminine qualities. A demigirl, identify partially as a girl, but not entirely. Demiguy, identifying partially as a guy, but not entirely. Transgender, identifying as a gender other than the one that they were assigned at birth. Cisgender, identifying as the gender you were assigned at birth. Genderqueer, outside the gender binary. and non-binary outside the gender binary as well, and is often used as an umbrella term or as its own identity all its own. And here's a great model that you can use to understand the intersection of gender and orientation to a degree. This is called the gender unicorn. It was designed, as you can see, by Lyndon Pan and Anna Moore. You can learn more about it by going to transstudent.org/gender. And there's a wonderful little great image of this unicorn, and you can see in different areas it looks at gender identity as this wonderful rainbow, and you can see it's basically based in the brain in that context, and how they think of themselves, how they feel about themselves, how they identify. And as you can see, there are varying different spectrums or continuums: female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, or other genders. Some of the ones that we just talked about: agender, gender fluid, demiguy, etc., etc. Gender expression, as you can see represented by these green dots all along the way, has to do with ways that people express themselves along a continuum of very feminine to less feminine, very masculine to less masculine, or in some other way. Sex assigned at birth, as you can see, focus specifically here on the genital area with regard to chromosomes, heredity, etc., your biological package. Female, male, other, and or in some context intersex. These two latter ones refer to sexual orientation in some way: physically attracted to, emotionally attracted to women, men, or other gender identities or expressions in some way. All right, folks, that's a quick and review of some of the organizing constructs of gender which you'll need throughout this course. And as you can see, this is a great tool with regard to language. Because oftentimes people get really tripped up around gender with language. Here's some tips. This is a say this, not that kind of grid. So you want to use terms like, say, sex assigned at birth versus real sex. Transgender person versus a transgender. Transgender people versus transgenders. The term transgender versus transgendered. You don't want to past tense that experience. Transgender man. We really are now avoiding the terms F to M, used to be a woman, born female. M to F, used to be a man, born a male. Using the term transgender woman. Medical transition versus a sex change versus pre-op versus post-op. And sexual orientation, not sexual preference, homosexual, etc. And as always, here are references. And good luck on your remainder of the course. Take care.